I'm excited to share with you what I think is the most unique Necromancer build that I've played to date. This is something I had kicking around in my head way back at the beginning of this season, and I get it, we're all just waiting for Season 2, Diablo 4 bad, that's fine. Go ahead and leave your comments, tell me it's a dead game, that's perfectly fine. But I wanted to share this with everybody because I kind of put it to pen and pad. I wrote out what I thought I would be great. I put it into a D4 planner on Maxroll. I'll have that down in the description for you. I'll also have timestamps every part of the video. But without further ado, I want to invite you all to the basic skill Necromancer. It's actually pretty good. So here we're running a tier 87 dungeon, and while we definitely run into some issues with the fact that the monsters were applying bleed, which is one of my least favorite affixes in the entirety of this game right now, we are very easily clearing packs. We have all the great CC that you typically expect to have in a Necromancer build with corpse tendrils, but all of this is completely revolving around empowering a very specific skill. And that's Bone Splinters. Bone Splinters is one of the 4 basic generator skills that the Necromancer has available to you. It's basically meant to do almost no damage at all and generate a ton of essence, hence why we call them the basic generator skills. Now, the 2 most important things about the skill are actually the tags that it has. 1, basic, so it has that designation as a basic skill, and 2, it's a bone skill. Now, why is a basic skill tag so important? Well, it turns out you can get a bunch of stats that are specific to basic skill, most notably basic skill attack speed and basic skill damage. You can get basic skill attack speed on your helmet, you can get it on an offhand weapon, and then you can get a huge amount of basic attack damage, both on a one-hander and a focus, or on a two-handed weapon. Not only that, the Royal Topaz specifically can be socketed into the weapon to give you even more additive basic skill damage. And the reason why the basic skill damage and the basic skill attack speed are so important is because they relate to a specific skill type, a very niche tag. They're typically overblown in how much they can benefit you. And what this basically means for this skill is that we're able to super empower it in ways that you wouldn't be able to empower other skills. Not only that, it doesn't use essence at all, and while you might think, well, yeah, of course it doesn't use essence as a generator, that becomes incredibly important when we look at the second tag for this skill, which is Bone. Bone skills have the best passives in the game for the Necromancer, one which just gives you additional critical strike chance for all of the essence that you have upon cast, then additional critical strike damage after you crit a bunch, and since Bone Splinters can hit a target 5 times, critting 5 times, you basically have this bonus up all of the time. And on top of that, you just deal an additional multiplicative critical strike damage against a target that's vulnerable, a thing that bone skills are incredibly good at doing. Then when you also look at the key passive for the bone tree, which just says you deal additional multiplicative damage for every single essence that you have, over 50 when you cast a bone skill. But notice it doesn't say anything about spending essence. Unlike Bone Spirit that says you have to spend the essence to get the multiplier, Ossified Essence and its aspect Serration just look at how much essence you have when you cast it. So since we can stack a ton of maximum essence as well as always be at full essence, we're always getting the maximum benefit out of this. With our regular buffs up and without having any elixirs on at all, Ossified Essence alone is giving us 2.5 times our total damage, and that's on every missile from Bone Splinters, which can be up to 5 missiles at a given time. Add on to the fact that there's an elixir that gives you an additional 50 maximum essence, that means that you can have a 3 times multiplier whenever you use Bone Splinters. And not only that, all these same things apply to Bone Storm, another bone skill that doesn't use essence on cast, but still gains the additional damage as well as the additional crit chance. And on top of that, it hits multiple times per second, meaning that we're able to easily stack up our compound fracture, easily apply additional damage through Avulsion, and then also very quickly stack up Bone Graft. Bone Graft is going to give us additional multiplicative damage and maximum essence on top of that. So when you put all of these parts of the engine together, all you have to do is ask the question, is there anything else that works with basic skills? One of the strongest attack speed aspects in the game that has no caveat to it at all is Rapid. Rapid just says that your basic skills gain 30% attack speed when you put it onto a ring. That's just free 30% attack speed on top of all the other attack speed we can put onto our gear. And while I haven't released the video yet, I've done a ton of research into just how important attack speed is, and I want to give you a quick little taste of that just to give you an idea of why it's so valuable. So if you saw a video I made a long time ago comparing a two-handed sword versus a two-handed scythe, I wanted to break down just how important attack speed was, and just a very quick TLDR of that. If we are using your basic two-handed sword, so an attack speed of once per second, it takes a certain number of frames for that skill to actually deal damage. It takes a certain number of frames for you to be able to run or interrupt the animation. And then on top of that, it also impacts just how quickly you become immune when you use a skill like Blood Mist. So here, while I'm not going to bore you with all the details, if we were just using a normal two-handed sword, We are able to deal damage 16 frames into the animation itself, so that's roughly a quarter of a second. We are able to move 22 frames after the animation starts, so about a third of a second. And then similarly to how quickly we can deal damage, we're able to enter into the immune status of something like Blood Mist in about a quarter of a second. Now what you're looking at in green here are all the different breakpoints I've been able to deduce. These are at certain amounts of attack speed you're able to reduce the total time it takes. So right here with the two-handed scythe as the example, it takes 17 frames for us to do damage when we use an attack like Bone Splinters, but if we have at least 25.85 attack speed, it only takes us 13 frames. So we're saving 4 frames, or a 15th of a second. So that basically means every 15 times that you cast a spell, you're saving a second. Just to give you an idea of the impact of attack speed. It gets a lot deeper than that, but again, I don't have all the data to share. Look forward to this in a future video. So this one aspect alone is cutting 4 frames off of every attack for when we're able to do damage and when we're able to start running or stutter stepping or gaining efficiency. And that's a single aspect. Then you add on things like Might, an aspect that says that whenever we use a basic skill, we gain 20% damage reduction for up to 6 seconds. And since all we're doing is using a basic attack, that means that we are perpetually maintaining an additional 20% damage reduction, which is huge. And just to give you an idea of how high these numbers get on a two-handed weapon, a maximum roll on basic skill damage here would get me 118.5% basic attack damage. Add on the fact that my helmet can gain me up to 15% basic attack speed. If I had an offhand weapon, I can gain an additional 15% increased attack speed. You're starting to see the benefits of a build that only uses a generator. And like I said before, I'm going to have a link to this D4 planner on Maxroll down in the description. If you just want to take a look at that, feel free to do so. I know not everybody really likes the video aspect of this, but I kind of want to break down the skill tree, our Paragon, our gear, and all the decisions that we made, again with timestamps down to everything below, so you can get a better idea of just how we came to the conclusions that we did, and so you can better pilot the build. Notable for the skill tree, just so you have everything that you need to be able to pilot it yourself, there are 2 different options here for which modifier you can choose. I'm using Bone Splinters applies vulnerable some percentage of the time, because I noticed that there was a little bit of a gap when we would have vulnerable up on a target at any given moment, especially if all of our corpses were being consumed by Ozius Gale, one of the aspects that we're using. But if you feel like you need the additional crit, which on our build with our gear we didn't need at this point, you can always use Acolyte's Bone Splinters to get you up to 100% chance to crit more easily. Obviously we're maxing up Bone Splinters because while the damage on the base skill isn't a huge amount, remember that not only do we always shoot 3 projectiles, which can all shotgun into the same target, 25% of the time we're firing off 2 additional. So that's a total of 5 total shards into the same target. When you got 5 shards going into the same target, that means at a skill rank of 5, you're doing 65% weapon damage, which really isn't that bad. Unliving energy to increase our maximum essence, since that's so important to get all the maximum buffs out of all of our bone aspects and bone skill tree decisions. Hewed flesh to be able to generate a ton of corpses. This is really important so that the sacrilegious heart can keep eating corpses to gain us the additional damage when we have consumed a corpse. But on top of that, having more targets to be able to hit with corpse tendrils. Our dump points end up going into Blood Mist for a little bit of cooldown reduction, and then Blood Mist generates corpses so that we can initiate a fight with Blood Mist. Everything will get hit by corpse tendrils from Sacrilegious Heart, then we can walk out and just start blasting. We only need the 1 point in Corpse Explosion. Now, you could go into Blighted Corpse Explosion, maybe even run Ultimate Shadow, and then you can mess around with some of the Shadow and Darkness skill aspects. I don't really think it's worth it, just the 1 point, so we can have that to perpetually be consuming corpses as we go. And then obviously fueled by that, so that when we eat the corpses, we get this immediate 1.09 times multiplier. Dark Embrace, because it says damage reduction and extra damage to close targets, which we are close all the time. We want to be able to shotgun every single shard into the pack that we're firing into, so the closer the better. Full up on amplified damage, since we're going to be casting Decrepify, and we have Decrepify here with Abhorrent Decrepify, so we have the chance to reduce cooldown for Bone Storm. We're able to apply a bunch of damage reduction slow to targets, get the crowd controlled status on them, etc. Now you may be asking why we're not using the Decrepit Heart, and it's because we actually want to slot in a second orange gem on top of our Wrathful Heart, but we'll get to that in just a second. Corpse Tendrils, because Corpse Tendrils is great. Corpse Tendrils generates Vulnerable, because we don't really care about Blood Orbs here. And then we're maxing out Serration for the crit chance from Essence, Compound Fracture, as well as Avulsion. We also have ranks from Avulsion on our amulet, but that's not important for you to understand the skill tree. And then we're picking up at least 1 point into Rapid Ossification. You might go, Literally, how are you spending essence on this build at all? When does that happen? And you can spam Decrepify and Stagger Walk with it, so you can be reducing the cooldown of Bone Storm as you go if you're really trying to get very sweaty and try hard. If you wanted to put additional points into this so it was a bit easier, you could take them out of Blood Mist. I was messing around with it, and just in general it slightly helped with uptime on Bone Storm, but we have other tools in our kit to be able to manage that better, so don't worry about this one too much. Inspiring Leader for the attack speed, Standalone for the additional damage reduction, and then Memento Mori for the additional bonuses for our sacrifices for crit chance, as well as vulnerable damage from our skeletons. Obviously Bone Storm with Supreme Bone Storm down here, basically every single build runs it, and then Ossified Essence to kind of tie it all together. Now, as a quick note, I don't explore it in this video here, but you can mess around with a shadow version of this using Reap, which gets you more attack speed and more damage reduction, and then you can kind of proc Shadow Blight a whole bunch with it, using the Blighted aspect and Decay to get a bunch of Shadow Blight procs, and I think that's definitely an awesome build. I had at least one member of my channel telling me about them messing around with that in High Nightmare dungeons about halfway through the season thus far, and they were having a blast with it. So if you were thinking about it, basically just swap out everything I did with Bone, but over to Darkness and Shadow, and you could probably replicate the same build with Reap as the basic skill. Now that we're done with the skill tree, you can better understand the aspects that we're picking. I'm not going to belabor it to death because you can always just pause and look at the stats that you want, but I'll try and touch on everything that's really important for you to understand. Basic skill, attack speed, and maximum essence are by far the most important stats on this helmet. Then we want survivability like total armor or maximum life, and here I'm going with cooldown reduction instead of the life because the armor is going to do our damage reduction for us, and the cooldown reduction is going to make it so we have Bone Storm up more often, giving us more barrier and more time on that damage reduction as well. Here we're putting Disobedience, and then we're slotting in a Ruby for maximum life. For the chest, all defensives, we want total armor, maximum life, damage reduction, and damage reduction from close. Damage reduction from close, total armor, and maximum life are bare necessities, and then any other type of damage reduction is obviously great. This is where we're putting on Might to gain that huge amount of damage reduction whenever we use a basic skill, and then we're slotting in rubies for maximum life as well. On the gloves, these are a little bit interesting. I also want to mess around with Fists of Fate. I just don't have a perfect roll on them right now, but there is a universe where the big roll on that would go a long way to increase our overall damage output. But for now, you want critical strike chance, attack speed, and critical strike damage with Bone skills. I'm slotting in intelligence here for even more base damage multiplier. You could go with all stats in case you need that to hit your Paragon tree requirements for the rare nodes. It's what you're looking for here. We don't super care about lucky hit on any of our gear, but it wouldn't be a dead stat here. And then because on this setup, I'm not using a two-handed weapon, we have Grasping Veins. If I was using a two-handed weapon, which I'm kind of tending towards might be the best setup for this, I would definitely put that onto the two-handed weapon and then move one of my other offensive aspects here. But with our current setup, with just having these on gloves, you will hit 100% chance to crit once you take everything else into account. For the pants, same thing as the chest, all survivability, and then this is where we're putting in Shielding Storm. Shielding Storm is required for the build because that's where you get all your barrier, so that you can benefit from things like Conceited if you are using an offhand version, but more importantly, just the huge amount of survivability that it provides. In addition to that, rubies go socketed into here. For the boots, we can kind of mess around with a couple different things here. I went with the highest damage and utility version of it, which would be movement speed, corpse tendrils ranks to bring down that cooldown, and then intelligence in all stats. You could also go with dodge chance, which I think would be pretty good for tankiness. And then there are a couple other stats that are kind of like not terrible to put on here, but I don't think any of them are really that much more valuable. You can also slot on movement speed when you kill an elite instead of the intelligence or the all stats as you need, because it's going to be a little bit difficult for you to get the movement speed on your amulet unless you sacrifice one of the more valuable stats there. Then to complement our movement speed, we're putting on Wind Striker. We're critting all the time. This basically just says you have permanent an additional 16% multiplier for your movement speed, which is great. For the amulet, cooldown reduction for Bone Storm, then we're using Avulsion ranks as the highest damage output. Also amplify damage wouldn't be terrible here, and Compound Fracture is a nice third place option. Then we're going damage reduction from close and movement speed. You could also go for total armor here. You could go for percentage intelligence or percentage dexterity, whatever you might need to fill out that part of your kit. And then here's where we're putting Serration to get the biggest multiplier on that. This is a 1.6 multiplier since we're always at maximum essence. And then I'm showing you slot in the Great Feast, a Wrathful Heart you probably haven't thought about in a bit. Since we're permanently using a generator, we are always at max essence. You never really need to worry about the drain here that you'll get on it, but if you do have it, it is just a 2x multiplier to all of your damage. That being said, while this build is really good at single target damage, it suffers a little bit from AoE damage, so at least in Season 1, I definitely think using the Barber goes a long way to be able to help speed out more damage and higher density, but having basically an identical amulet that you literally just slot in the Great Feast and then move it over for single target bosses or against Lilith would probably be really nice. For the rings, these are going to look the exact same except for what's slotted in them in the aspect, but you want maximum essence, vulnerable damage, and critical strike chance. On this ring, I'm putting sacrificial. That's going to get us a huge additional bump to the crit chance, as well as vulnerable damage and crit damage multiplier from all of our sacrifices in the Book of the Dead, which we'll touch on in just a quick second. And I'm also using the Faded Heart, which is going to give you a huge amount of additional additive critical strike damage whenever you successfully crit and reduce your non-critical strike damage. But again, since we have 100% chance to crit with all of our skills, this basically just means it is a free plus 85% critical strike damage, which goes a long way to offset how much they had nerfed critical strike damage. On the second ring, we are slotting in Rapid for that huge amount of increased attack speed with basic skills, and then we're using Sacrilegious. Now, there's a universe where you could actually just be using the Decrepit Heart, so you don't have to worry about casting Decrepify yourself, but I found that passively consuming the corpses as we went, be able to maintain Fueled by Death and Flesh Eater was just a lot stronger. It made the build a lot more viable, a lot more mobile and efficient. Now, what I'm showing right now is a one-hand and an offhand. You could always be using a two-handed sword, and you basically want the exact same stats from this sword, but on the two-hander. So you want basic skill damage, vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, and then critical strike damage with bone skills. You can also go with a huge amount of intelligence here, or all stats. The intelligence might actually end up being more valuable than the critical strike damage with bone skills, but it comes down to what exact stats your build has. Then you'll notice that we're slotting in a very interesting gem, the Topaz, for additional additive basic skill damage. While I'm not 100% sure that mathematically speaking, this is the strongest option, I wanted to do a build that used basic skill gems, and gosh damn it, I was gonna do it. So here's what you got. Also, it just looks super cool seeing a Topaz in a weapon. Then here we're using Ozius Gale. Ozius Gale to get better uptime on Bone Storm. It comes along with its own gameplay headaches. I do think in general it's just pretty powerful for the cost of needing to switch up your gameplay style a lot. Basically, just make sure you've actually cast Corpse Tendrils before you cast Bone Storm, so that Bone Storm doesn't eat up all of your corpses. You're not sitting there wondering why you haven't procced anything. Then for the offhand focus, if you are using it, we want to get basic skill damage and basic skill attack speed here, which is one of the major reasons why I'd use a focus. The other side of that though is that using a focus does gain you additional implicit cooldown reduction, which is super valuable. Additional cooldown reduction in the stats themselves, and you can also pick up crit chance here if you're missing some from the rest of your gear. Then you'll notice I'm using the Conceited aspect, a great 1.25 multiplier whenever we have barrier up, which should basically be all of the time, and then another Topaz for basic skill damage. For our Book of the Dead, we are sacrificing our Skirmishers for crit chance. We're sacrificing Cold Mages for vulnerable damage. Now, I get asked a lot of the time, why aren't you sacrificing Shadow for the maximum essence? Isn't it the same or even better? The sacrifice here for Cold Mages is actually a new 1.15 multiplier. It doesn't increase your vulnerable damage by 15%. It doesn't add 15% to your vulnerable damage. It is a new multiplier if you are dealing damage to a vulnerable target, different than your vulnerable damage bonus. So that's why it's more valuable. And then obviously sacrificing Iron Golem for the critical strike damage, which again is its own multiplier. So this, on top of the sacrificial aspect, gets you a huge additional new critical strike damage multiplier, which is very nice. You could also sacrifice the Bone Golem for additional attack speed here, but you probably don't need it. And here for the Paragon tree, I'm not going to bore you to death with the details, but I'll just show you it very quickly and you can take a look on the planner later. But we are building into sacrificial in the initial board to have that 1.1 multiplier up all the time since we're not using any summons. We then build into Bone Graft with exploit for a huge amount of additional vulnerable damage. I'm building all the way out to Bone Graft here. I am picking up the additional maximum essence in Reinvigorate, and we're picking up everything in Calcified and all of the damage nodes around Entomb. Into Flesh Eater, we obviously want to pick up Flesh Eater because we will have this damage bonus up all of the time, picking up everything through Stifle, and then we're going to build over here into Territorial. We're always going to be close to the targets, so it's a huge amount of additional additive damage, and on top of that, it's going to gain us a really nice additional amount of damage reduction, which is huge for keeping us alive. Now, depending on what specific weapon you're using and specific amount of attack speed that you get up to, this amount of additional attack speed may be completely useless for you in your build. I'm sorry that I don't already have the numbers to tell you, but if you feel like you want to attack faster, you'd pick these up. If not, save the points and perhaps build into a 6th board with an incomplete glyph. That's one of the options that you have available to you. Building into Scent of Death, here's where we're throwing Imbiber to be able to pick up a bunch of willpower and get a huge amount of additive damage out of it. This is really important because it's kind of hard to pick up all the willpower node bonuses that we have in the rest of our Paragon board without investing at least a decent amount into willpower here. And then I also go over to Corrective, and as you can see here, at least on my current gear, I don't currently have all of the willpower that you would need, but here's where you'd pick up a bunch of additional critical strike damage with the magic nodes as well. And then lastly, we're going to build into Bloodbath just to pick up the glyph socket to be able to put in Essence. And here's where the debate between Great Feast and the Barber becomes a bit more nuanced and interesting. Essence says that you only gain this new 1.22 critical strike damage multiplier if the target is not healthy, so anything below 80% of their maximum life. The interesting part is that since the Barber, especially if you have a 4-second timer, is going to treat the monster as if they are healthy until you deal damage below that amount and it explodes, it basically means that you're losing out on a 1.22 multiplier the entirety of the time if your timer would take you longer to get down to the non-healthy status than the base damage you would be doing. That's a bunch of like overly nuanced nerd speak to say there's a universe where Great Feast is better for you in a lot of different circumstances, and it'd be up to you to play around with both of them to see what you personally like. There you have it. There's my basic skill Necromancer build. I cleared a tier 87 today. I haven't played Diablo really in like the past week or two. I've just been busy with other projects. So it was really interesting to just kind of hop back on, theorycraft a build, did it all on stream. If you don't know, I stream just about every single day, Monday through Friday on twitch.tv/MacroBioBoi. There's always a link in the description down below, but you can come watch me literally do this theorycrafting in real time, testing it out, see me record these types of videos, mess up, you get to see all the bloopers. I think most people have a ton of fun while they're watching. So if you haven't already, come check it out. I'd really love to have you there. But there you go. If you haven't seen somebody else try out this build, or if you have and you think that they came up with a better way, let me know down in the comments below. If you've messed around with it yourself, I'd love to hear from you, because theorycrafting these wild things, even when a season is dead or Diablo 4 bad, whatever the haters want to say, it gives me an immense amount of joy. And hopefully this inspires you to play the game a little bit differently than maybe you've considered doing in the past. But again, thank you so much for watching. I truly hope that it helps, or at the very least entertained you. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.